agree.
Yeah, it's nice.
I think we can enter here. Recuperated.
Poppy flowers.
Yeah, well, it's somewhat incongruous, I would say. You also use this very interesting notion of Raumgeschehen. And Raumgeschehen, I find it very intriguing because if you translate it into English, Geschehen means to happen but also to take place. Now it's something that takes place in a space. And this I find very interesting. It takes place, so you have a localized version, but at the same time there is a larger space. And you have to establish the relationship between what happens locally in the place and what happens in the space, and how do the two interact with each other. You open the space, this is the Raum. At the same time, this is what I mean by saying in English, you say it takes place. And you have to put the two into mutual interaction. You have to link the two. And then all kinds of new options appear. It also allows you to go into various directions in this multidimensional space. You open up many more possibilities and spaces for the imagination, but at the same time also for what may happen, will happen. I think it has a lot to do with knowledge, with the creation of knowledge, with the sharing of knowledge, with the transmitting of knowledge. You know, for me, intuitively, design in the sense of the Italian disegno, it means to throw out a line that can be straight, curved, whatever. You throw it out on a piece of white paper. And then I think it develops a life of its own because you perceive it. It reacts back on you. We are able to interpret white spaces. And therefore, our imagination goes with it, and an object forms in our imagination just by looking what we did before by throwing out something. So this is my intuitive understanding of design. Something that has to do with process, it has to do with interaction and the perception and reaction back, but of course it's a multi-party and multi-link that exists because it's not just between me and myself, but it's between me and the world. Of course, the moment we walk out, something exists already there. We get into contact. So the line is deepened, the line is flexible, the line is plastic, the line is dynamic. It also unfolds in time. The processual element is very important. We walk, walking is movement. So it unfolds, and from this point of view, I would say, you know, my line is the minimalistic metaphor of design. I think there are two very different notions about design. If you ask people what do they associate with design, many people will tell you we have an object, or we have a function, we have a purpose. And then there are different ways of getting there, there are different ways of expressing it or putting the form into the service of a function. And then you have design in the way how you mentioned it, namely as an open-ended process, and not knowing as yet how the space will be filled. And I come back to Raumgeschehen, because it allows you not just to focus one object, but to say we have an enormous space of possibilities. And there are different ways of linking what you see, what you perceive, what you touch, to the space in which it is framed. And that is partly curiosity-driven, partly it is a process that you don't know what the next step will bring. So the main point is it's open-ended. You are dealing with a lot of possibilities. And just as we said before, there is no definite answer, the one answer. There may be a cluster of answers. If you jump too quickly, you take one of the many possibilities and in a sense you lock it in. Yeah. And very rarely is such a locked-in solution the optimal solution. So it's good if you look at alternatives, if you deliberate also what is a good solution for the purpose at hand in the end. And this is why your method has a lot to go for it. But people do become impatient because we live in a society where we believe we can find solutions for all problems, although the solutions very quickly create new problems, which we then have to face. It is very difficult for us to foresee the unintended consequences of our action in general, but also the unintended consequences if you set about how to develop a region. Therefore, the best answer we have now is really something like complex adaptive systems. Yeah. It can be reduced somewhat, but create more spaces for the unexpected. It's of course the difficulty, because you also have to do with buildings, with structures, and every structure, once it's there, it allows you to do certain things, but it constrains you at the same time. So you have to balance, you have to have a trade-off between what is there, what you want it to do, and at the same time to give you as much flexibility as possible. So that's the big challenge. For me, it's really people that make the difference. And so once you begin to interact with people, it changes me and it changes the place. Places are made for people. So and certainly an urban landscape is made for people and therefore for interaction with people. I think there is an intuitive way of trying to understand something that the psychologists call it Gestalt, you know, to get a feeling for the place intuitively. And then you say, well, what do I find interesting here? And this can be very different. You have many questions. What is the most interesting question? This depends on what you're doing. Intuitively, whenever I come to a place where I've not been before, I do something similar. Yeah. And for you, I think it's very important, how can you put it on a more systematic basis? And how can you also transmit it to other people so that their experience becomes something that is feasible, viable, and leads to new ways of coming to terms with the environment and this mutual relationship that we have. I mean, we recognize the creative moment because we know, and in German we call it Einfall. It's a sudden, momentous event that takes place. And retrospectively, we can only say, well, I've been doing this before, I've been doing that before. But then it's like pulling up the ladder, you know, you have walked up the ladder, you have arrived where you wanted to go, but then you have to pull up the ladder as well. So the creative moment is after you have pulled up the ladder. What you are doing is to switch between the conscious and the unconscious way of being in the world, perceiving the world. And what is important is to have the right kind of alterations between the two, because we cannot stay indefinitely in the unconscious. No. and to find out what also is for you as an individual the best rhythm of changing, because I think there are individual variations. I think we all have this experience when you have to make decisions that you realize are important. And then either you know right away or you are undecided. And then in my case, I let my unconscious work it out for me. And I tell myself, I'm not thinking about it now, my unconscious will work on it, and then I go back and talk to my unconscious. What is it you suggest I should do? And this goes so far that there's a phenomenon which is recognized, which are called lucid dreams.
Does it work for science?
Of course, of course, of course. One of the most difficult questions is really what makes a good question. And it's very difficult to teach what is a good question. The reason is a very simple one. It's about judgment. Once you try to objectify judgment, you can only go so far. In the end, there is this way to discern, and this is a part of the human faculty we have. When I speak about judgment, it's expression. Expression is based on judgment. So it's not saying this is good or bad. I mean judgment in the sense of saying this is interesting, this is not interesting, this is relevant for this particular purpose, this is not relevant. It's a good way of really pushing people. What is it you have experienced? What is it you have learned? What kind of shape of gestalt do you give to it? Walking is one of the oldest human techniques, I would say, of experiencing your surroundings, the environment, and at the same time getting to know the environment, but also eventually shaping the environment. Observation is one of the oldest scientific methods. So walking around, you observe, and once you start to interact with people, it becomes a kind of mini exploration, I would say. So you explore the way how this space is peopled, populated by people, their histories in the end. And then, of course, with observation and with exploration, you have to take the next step, which is some kind of analytic comparison. Because then you have to ask yourself, so what are the conclusions, the inferences that I can draw from this now? And exploration, I mean, you can explore so that you get a general idea of what is happening, or you can go into greater details and do it more precisely. You can do it qualitatively, you can do it quantitatively. You can do all kinds of comparisons, and this is a scientific way of approaching it. But I think you are, taking us upstream, so to say, to where the source lies. Mm-hmm. And most people, when they speak of science, they look already when the river flows, except you let the mind wander. Mm-hmm. And it's part of the way how the scientific process gets started, but it's upstream. Mm. And being upstream and being not reproducible at will, it does not meet the criterion of an experiment. And I would say science needs both. You need the creative moment that you cannot reproduce at will. You can create certain conditions. And downstream, you need to have some kind of verification. Yeah, so I would say it is important to encourage people to take the Raumgeschehen very seriously and to look at possible links between what is taking place and the space in which it is taking place. So the Geschehen but in the Raum, in the larger picture, in the whole. And then to encourage them not to think what is the most elegant way of expressing myself, or will I be up to expectations of my group or of your expectations, but rather to encourage them to say whatever comes to their mind. And it is not a definite statement, it is not going to be enshrined in stone, but rather it is one of many possible links that exist between what is taking place and the space. In science, it's recognized the important part of intuition, but what counts in the end is you have to move on from there, and you have to move on to an experiment, an outcome, finding, etc. And there are also well-known people like François Jacob. He spoke about day science and night science. Mm-hmm. And night science for him was this, struggling with an idea, struggling with an experiment, not really knowing what the outcome is, or you do something, it has to be redone. And all this is of no interest to day science. Day science only wants to see the end results, it has to work, and day science does not care how you got there. What is still valid about Mode 2, it takes the coming together of a diverse group of people from different disciplines or sub-disciplines, even from different institutions, so diversity in whatever way you define it, and they come together and they formulate and define together what is the problem, the project they want to work on. And then they go back, it's not something that is made for eternity and to last. But rather it's a mode of working where you bring this diversity together, and there has to be mutual respect for the knowledge you bring to it. So no one is in a hierarchical way, the one who calls the shot, as one says. And I think this is still valid. Maybe the problem you have is that it's very difficult to show to the outside world what you do in the imaginative part. Yeah. Because it somehow stays in what people think and imagine, etc. And therefore, it probably needs to find some form of expression to the outside world so that you can communicate what you do with the imagination. I think you need to find a way of expressing the outcome of your imagination and the imaginative part that you work so interestingly and hard to get to. It's not enough if after the 3 days you say of the 150 people, 75 have said this and that. Really challenge them. How can you tell the world what is the outcome? Take it one step further and find a form in which you can communicate this to the outside world. We have been walking, talking, and how do we tell the outside world what we have been doing?